There is a single photograph that should not exist. It is labeled D74-19 in a fading archival log, though some insist the log itself is a forgery. The image, allegedly captured in the spring of 1874 at Danvers State Hospital, depicts a young patient in a long exposure portrait. At first glance it resembles any clinical plate of the era, but the eyes are wrong. The child's gaze splits across the exposure, doubling into two sets of pupils suspended midshift. A chemical smear drags them into alignment that never existed in the flesh. One pair looks straight at the lens, the other peers aside, defying anatomy. The effect is subtle, almost easy to dismiss, yet viewers linger on it with unease. It does not look like a trick of light. It looks deliberate. Some researchers argue the photograph is a hoax, staged decades later and backdated into the file. Others maintain that the plate once hung in the hospital's diagnostic gallery before disappearing in 1938. What survives today is only the entry in the index, coupled with references in physician correspondence. If the negative ever existed, it is gone. This is the file that should not exist, and yet it anchors one of the most contested accounts in asylum history. Behind the blurred image lies the story of a child whose sudden transformation unsettled both science and faith. Her case is traced through scattered logs, private letters, and fragments of testimony. The records never align perfectly. The dates contradict, the locations blur, but something happened in those wards during 1874, and three anomalies appear again and again: a rupture in language, a contagion of behavior, and the impossible endurance of a body that should have failed. Witnesses claimed her change came overnight. Official records place her in the hospital before the building was even finished. Reports insist she spoke in a dead tongue, yet notes in the same file call her education rudimentary. Across all of it hangs the question of authenticity. Did this child truly fracture reality, or have generations of archivists built a myth from errors and rumors? The truth may never resolve cleanly, but the fragments, letters from physicians, notations in metabolic studies, and a vanished glass plate photograph compose a narrative too consistent to ignore, whether one believes in possession, pathology, or fabrication. The story of Eleanor C. has haunted the ruins of Danvers for nearly a century and a half. The first anomaly was her language, the second, her influence over others, the third, the photograph itself. Each builds upon the other, escalating from disturbing to inexplicable. Each leaves behind the faint trace of documentation, just enough to demand attention, never enough to secure certainty. Before we examine her transformation, we must look at the place that confined her. Danvers State Hospital, known then as the State Lunatic Hospital at Danvers, rose in the aftermath of war, immigration, and fear. Its walls held thousands of lives, many forgotten. Yet among them, one child's case remains impossible to erase. In the years after the American Civil War, Massachusetts stood at a crossroads. The state expanded rapidly, drawing immigrants into its industrial towns. Boston pulsed with new wealth, new unrest, and new demands upon its institutions. Among the gravest questions was how to house and treat the growing number of citizens. Labeled insane, public fear mingled with reformist zeal. The asylum movement promised order. It promised compassion, but also containment. The state poured funds into new facilities, declaring them the humane alternative to prisons and alms. Into this moment emerged the Danvers State Hospital. Perched on a hill above the town of Danvers, the structure appeared more like a fortress than a refuge, its red brick wings unfurled in rigid symmetry, a design inspired by the Kirkbride plan meant to embody moral order in architecture. Completed according to official records in 1878, Danvers was called the crown jewel of moral treatment. Newspapers praised its airy wards, its tall windows, its views of the surrounding countryside, yet the timeline already falters. Some hospital files mention patient intakes as early as 1874, 4 years before the building was finished. The contradiction unsettles researchers. Was there an earlier structure on the site, a temporary ward, or are the files themselves mis? Clerks of the era were not immune to error, but the overlap is persistent enough that many doubt coincidence. By the mid-1870s, psychiatry remained a primitive science. Physicians spoke of moral hygiene more than chemistry or anatomy. Treatments ranged from enforced rest to crude experiments with electricity. Overcrowding came almost instantly. The optimism of moral treatment collapsed into the reality of locked wards and forgotten patients. Still, Danvers carried a reputation beyond medicine. Folklore spread quickly. Locals called the hilltop cursed, a site of psychic unrest. Some whispered it was built on land tied to the Salem witch trials, though the historical record is murky. What mattered was the aura. Danvers was never seen as an ordinary hospital. Its silhouette against the Massachusetts sky stirred unease. Within those walls, patients arrived from every background. Veterans scarred by war trauma, immigrants unable to navigate a foreign tongue, children abandoned by families. All were recorded in ledgers that now sit incomplete, many pages lost. But scattered among them is one set of entries that refuses to blend into the blur of statistics. The name appears as Eleanor C., though even this may be an alias imposed by later archivists. Her file is redacted, portions blacked out in the 1920s. The fragments that survive begin in March of 1874. They describe not a gradual illness but a sudden transformation. An ordinary child, by every account, altered in a single night. The contradictions deepen. How could she have been admitted to a building that did not yet exist? If the intake is genuine, then she was held in some earlier facility, later merged into the Danvers archive. If the intake is false, then the entire narrative collapses into invention. Yet the persistence of the name in multiple ledgers, the appearance of the photograph in a separate index, and the physician's letters preserved in private estates all point to something more than clerical error. This is where the story begins to resist ordinary history. The asylum stands documented. The patient file, though incomplete, is real. The date remains the fracture line. In that gap, folklore has flourished. Some say the discrepancy is deliberate, a cover to disguise experiments carried out before the hospital officially opened. Others argue the child never existed at all, and the photo is the only anchor for a myth that grew afterward. What is certain is that by the late spring of 1874, letters circulated among physicians describing a child patient unlike any they had encountered. Her language shifted overnight, her behavior escalated beyond comprehension, and her presence, they warned, seemed to spread through the ward like a contagion. It is from this unstable foundation, half fact, half rumor, that the case of Eleanor C. unfolds. Her story begins on a date that repeats through every surviving account, March 3, 1874. That morning, Eleanor C. was described as an ordinary child, 9 years old, a ward of the state after her mother's death. Physicians recorded her intake as routine, noting no hereditary illness, no remarkable behavior. By nightfall, she was no longer ordinary. According to the attending nurse, Eleanor ceased speaking in English altogether. She did not lapse into silence. She spoke fluently, urgently, in a language no one in the ward could recognize. The nurse wrote that the words sounded old, sharp, and formal. Later comparison identified the phrases as Latin. Though of a variety not taught in Boston schools, the child's education by all accounts was minimal. Her background offered no explanation. Yet her writing that night left little doubt. She scrawled across the margins of a medical form, producing full sentences in archaic script. The page survives only in a partial transcript copied into a physician's notes. Scholars who reviewed it in the 20th century confirmed the grammar was consistent with medieval ecclesiastical Latin, far beyond what a 9-year-old from Massachusetts could know. The attending physician, Dr. Silas Gray, recorded the event privately. His letter to a colleague describes the child's shift as immediate and complete. He emphasized that she spoke without hesitation, as if her entire lexicon had been replaced in an instant. Witnesses claimed she no longer answered to her given name. When called Eleanor, she did not respond. Instead, she reportedly identified herself with a phrase that loosely translates to the one who has returned. From that moment, the physicians considered her case unusual, but they expected a medical explanation, perhaps delirium, perhaps some form of hysteria. They placed her under observation, noting every word and movement, yet the records suggest that nothing about her condition conformed to known categories of disease. One detail recurs across the testimony: Eleanor's eyes. Staff wrote that she would not fix her gaze upon the person speaking to her. Instead, she focused somewhere else, as though following something just outside their sight. The eyes are not vacant, Dr. Gray wrote. They are intent, but never upon the present. In the first 48 hours, her speech remained exclusively Latin. By the third day, she began to scribble symbols alongside her writing, sigils, geometric sketches, fragments of text. At least one staff member recognized the markings from church records, though no consensus survives on what they represented. The event is remembered now as the overnight switch. A child who spoke English fluently on the morning of March 3rd spoke only in archaic Latin by the evening. No transition, no blending of tongues, only rupture. This became the first anomaly, and it established the pattern, a sudden change, confirmed by witnesses, preserved in fragmentary notes, yet irreconcilable with the official record. What followed was escalation, behaviors and phenomena that grew steadily more difficult to dismiss, and it began with her knowledge of death. In the days following the switch, Eleanor's condition did not stabilize. Instead, it deepened into something far more troubling. Physicians first thought the strange language would fade, that exhaustion or suggestion would return her to English. Instead, her behavior escalated. On March 7th, according to ward notes, she began to recount details of deaths within the surrounding towns. These were not vague premonitions. They were precise accounts of events already concluded. She spoke of funerals that had taken place, naming families and quoting epitaphs. One such case involved the death of a farmer named Isaac Harlow in nearby Peabody. His burial had occurred 2 days before Eleanor's recital. She described the grave's position in the cemetery, and repeated phrases reportedly spoken by his widow at the graveside. According to the staff present, none in the ward could have attended the event. The information should have been inaccessible. Doctors recorded her words with unease, Dr. Gray wrote. She speaks not as a child who imagines, but as one recalling her own attendance. The phrasing carried a disturbing implication that she claimed witness to rights she could not have seen in the following week. The pattern continued. Eleanor would fix her eyes on a corner of the room, fall silent, then deliver descriptions of local deaths, always recent, always verifiable. Parish registers and newspaper notices later confirmed the names, yet no one could explain how the information reached her. Alongside this morbid knowledge came a fascination with imagery of death. She requested paper and charcoal, and began to draw. The sketches preserved in the archive show crude outlines of human figures, but within their chests she rendered organs, hearts, lungs, veins far beyond her supposed education. One sketch shows a ribcage split, with the lungs shaded in meticulous proportion. Another displays a heart suspended outside the body, connected by branching vessels. The authenticity of these drawings remains debated. Some argue they were altered later, touched by adult hands. Others maintain they are genuine products of the child herself. If they are genuine, they suggest anatomical knowledge far beyond her reach. Nurses described her demeanor during these drawings as calm, even absorbed. She hummed quietly while sketching, though no one recognized the tune. But her fixation troubled the staff. This was not the play of imagination, they felt. It was obsession. Her physical state deepened the mystery. By mid-March she had ceased eating altogether. She refused bread, broth, even water, turning away with a dismissive shake of the head. Yet her weight remained stable for weeks. The daily wains recorded no loss. Her skin did not wither, her energy did not collapse. Physicians struggled to account for this anomaly. Notes described metabolic irregularity of uncertain cause. They monitored her pulse, her temperature, her breathing. Each reading confounded them further. The expected decline never came. She remained impossibly in equilibrium. Dr. Gray wrote to a colleague, "We have seen patients waste to bone in a matter of days. Here the absence of intake produces no decline. It is as if she is sustained by something beyond the ordinary." Not all staff agreed. One attendant claimed Eleanor secretly accepted food from other children, but searches turned up nothing. Bowls left untouched, cups unemptied. Still, the rumor of secret sustenance circulated. By late March, the child's behavior unsettled the ward as a whole. Other children began to avoid her, whispering that she knew too much. One boy reportedly cried out that Eleanor had described his grandmother's death before the family had received word. Days later, the letter arrived, confirming the detail. The doctors faced an impossible dilemma: to label her knowledge delusional risked ignoring coincidences; to precise, to label it supernatural invited ridicule. So they documented carefully, noting every date and detail, while refusing to draw conclusions. Her case file grew thick: language anomaly, death knowledge, morbid art, metabolic irregularity. Each could be explained away separately: scholastic influence, coincidence, forgery, deceit. But taken together, the pattern resisted dismissal. By the end of March, Eleanor had become a ward spectacle. Nurses whispered outside her door. Children kept their distance. Physicians filled their private journals with cautious notes. What had begun as a single rupture now showed signs of contagion and influence spreading beyond her body, into the minds of those forced to witness. The stage was set for the second escalation: prophecy, accident, and the lowering of her pulse into the realm of the impossible. By April of 1874, the child's presence in the ward had shifted from curiosity to threat. The earlier fascination with her strange language and macabre drawings gave way to dread. The staff began to fear her predictions. The first recorded case came on April 4th, according to the notes of Nurse Collins. Eleanor approached a tray of medical instruments and whispered in Latin a single phrase, translated later as, "The glass will cut on the third day." Nothing more. The staff ignored it, chalking the words to her ongoing mutterings. On April 7th, an orderly slipped while cleaning, shattering a glass vial and slicing his palm. The cut matched precisely what Eleanor had described on the exact date she had named. Collins wrote that the incident unsettled the ward deeply. The other nurses whispered that the child's words carried weight. From then on, staff began recording her utterances with meticulous care. Over the next 2 weeks, at least 5 more incidents occurred, each aligned with Eleanor's earlier statements. She predicted the collapse of a rickety chair in the dining hall, the scalding of a nurse by spilled water, even the sudden illness of a fellow patient. In each case, the event followed the date she had given. Some attendants dismissed it as suggestion. They argued that staff, primed by her warnings, unconsciously fulfilled them. Others muttered that the girl was cursed, her words carrying the weight of invocation. The split mirrored a larger divide: medicine against faith. Several physicians resisted giving her predictions. They called it hysteria, perhaps unconscious manipulation by the child herself. Yet a few admitted privately that the precision disturbed them. "This is no vague fortune-telling," Dr. Gray wrote. "These are declarations of accidents with exact days affixed. It is beyond coincidence." As word spread, a local priest was summoned. Though his official involvement never appeared in hospital ledgers, letters reference his visit in mid. He reportedly attempted prayers over Eleanor, commanding her in Latin to cease her utterances. Witnesses later claimed she responded fluently, countering his invocations with older, harsher phrasing. No transcript survives, only the suggestion that the priest left pale, shaken, unwilling to return. Meanwhile, the medical staff tightened control. They placed Eleanor under closer restraint during episodes, fearing she might induce panic. Yet restraint raised its own problems. Monitors began documenting her pulse dropping to levels that should have been fatal. On April 12, one reading recorded a pulse of 22 beats per minute, sustained for several minutes, during which she remained fully conscious and alert. The anomaly repeated throughout the month. Her pulse fell again and again, each time lower than expected survivability. At its lowest, physicians recorded a rate of 16 beats per minute, yet her eyes remained open, her breathing steady, her speech uninterrupted. One doctor scribbled in disbelief, "This child lives where no heart may live." Efforts to rationalize faltered. Some suggested faulty instruments. Others accused staff of exaggeration, but multiple doctors signed the logbook entries, affirming the numbers. If they were inventions, they were collective. The hospital administration faced a crisis. On one side stood the physicians, determined to preserve medical authority. On the other stood whispers of possession, fueled by the priest's departure and the growing unease of the staff. Letters to the superintendent warned of a contagion of fear. A sense that the girl's presence eroded morale across the entire ward. April closed with tension unresolved. The child continued to predict accidents. The accidents continued to occur. Her pulse readings defied physiology. The ward divided between those who viewed her as a patient and those who saw her as something else entirely. The official stance remained neutral. The ledgers speak only of episodes and irregularities, but the private letters, the marginal notes, the gossip recorded in nurse diaries reveal a different atmosphere. The physicians could not suppress it. The staff could not ignore it. By the middle of the month, the superintendent authorized measures beyond observation. Eleanor would be isolated. Tests would be conducted. The church would be pushed aside, the hospital asserting science over superstition. Yet even here the record fractures. Some files state the order was given on April 14th, others insist it was April 18. 4 days vanish into contradiction. That discrepancy, more as it seems, marks the threshold of the next stage: isolation, experimentation, and the spread of her influence beyond her own body. The atmosphere inside Danvers in April 1874 was tense, brittle, and divided. Every incident widened the fault line between those who sought supernatural explanations and those determined to preserve medical authority. The hospital could not accommodate both. The church entered quietly, through the side door of influence. A local priest, unnamed in official logs but referenced in multiple letters, was brought into the ward. His visit was not public, not sanctioned by the superintendent. It was requested privately by staff who feared Eleanor's condition exceeded medicine. Witnesses later claimed he attempted an informal rite. He prayed in Latin, commanding the child to renounce her words. Instead, Eleanor answered in the same tongue, but with archaic phrasing no one else understood, according to one nurse. The exchange resembled dialogue more than exorcism, a debate rather than a casting out. The priest's notes, if they ever existed, were lost. All that survives is reference in Dr. Gray's correspondence, where he wrote, "Clerical influence has been tried. It has failed, or at least it has not diminished the disturbance." The priest never returned. In the aftermath, medical authority tightened its hold. The superintendent insisted the matter remain under hospital jurisdiction, a question of science rather than spirit. To acknowledge the church's involvement would, in his view, undermine the legitimacy of psychiatry itself. The decision was made to isolate Eleanor. Physicians argued it would prevent contagion of behavior, shield other patients from her influence, and allow more controlled observation. Yet here the record split. Some ledgers mark the isolation order as April 14th, others cite April 18. The inconsistency is never explained. Those 4 days matter, because they frame another event hinted at in letters, the alleged exorcism attempt. If the April 14th date is correct, then the priest's visit must have occurred before Eleanor's isolation. If the April 18th date is correct, then his visit took place after she was already confined. Both cannot be true. The ambiguity leaves scholars divided. Some believe the later date was backfilled, adjusted to conceal the church's involvement. Others suggest simple clerical error, but the pattern of contradictions across her file makes every error suspicious. Inside the hospital, the split grew sharper. Nurses confided their unease in private diaries, noting dreams of Eleanor's voice echoing in the night. Some begged for reassignment to other wards. One even requested dismissal. Meanwhile, the physicians prepared for controlled experimentation, metabolic testing, pulse measurement, and exposure to electrogalvanic apparatus. What emerges from this moment is not resolution. With escalation of institutional conflict, the church retreated, leaving only rumors of an unfinished rite. The doctors advanced, determined to preserve authority by testing the child as a medical specimen. Yet the line between faith and science did not vanish. It lingered in whispers. Even among physicians, there were quiet admissions that her case did not belong to medicine. Dr. Gray confessed in a marginal note, The phenomena exceed our classifications. It is either deceit, or else we trespass on territory unknown. Still, the official narrative moved forward under the banner of science. The order for isolation, whether on April 14th or April 18th, was carried out. Eleanor was removed from the ward. She was placed in a single-room cell with observation slots cut into the door. The transition marked a turning point. No longer was she one patient among many. She became a case apart, an object of scrutiny, a vessel upon which both faith and medicine had projected their failures. From this chamber, her influence would not recede. It would grow. For in the weeks that followed, other children in the ward began to echo her words, scratch her sigils, and dream her dreams. The phenomenon spread beyond her body, into the minds of those around her. And with that spread came the fear of contagion. Isolation did not contain her, it magnified her. Within a week of Eleanor's removal from the ward, other children began to mirror her behaviors. The first case was a boy of 7, admitted for epilepsy. He startled the nurses by speaking a Latin phrase while half asleep. The words were incomplete, garbled, but recognizable. The staff insisted he had never been exposed to the language. Days later, 2 more children in the ward began scratching marks into the wood of their bed frames. When examined, the patterns resembled the same angular sigils Eleanor had drawn on paper. The similarity was undeniable, though the children swore they did not know their meaning. The staff whispered of contagion. Physicians tried to describe it as imitation. They argued that children are suggestible, that they copied behaviors they had witnessed. Yet Eleanor had been removed from the ward, her contact severed. The children had no access to her drawings. Still, the behaviors multiplied. By the end of April, nearly half a dozen children exhibited symptoms. One began reciting phrases during meals. Another stood motionless for hours, eyes fixed in the same distant stare Eleanor was known for. A third scratched his hands until they bled, muttering that he must draw the signs. The superintendent noted the spread in a letter to the state board. We confront a crisis of influence. The disturbance extends beyond the patient herself. The phrasing was clinical, but the implication was clear: something in the ward was spreading without direct contact. Nurses reported their own disturbances. Several described dreams in which they heard Eleanor's voice calling through the halls, though she was locked alone in her chamber. One nurse claimed she awoke to find her lips moving, speaking words she did not understand. Another confessed she dreamed of standing in Eleanor's cell, only to wake and discover she had walked in her sleep, halfway down the ward corridor. Fear deepened, staff turnover increased. Some requested reassignment. Others wrote anonymous notes to the administration warning that Eleanor's presence threatened the stability of the entire hospital. The physicians struggled to keep control of the narrative. In their official reports, they labeled the phenomenon psychogenic influence. They argued that hysteria spreads, and children are particularly vulnerable. But in private, their tone shifted. One doctor wrote, "This is no mere imitation. The words are not heard but arise unbidden in the mouths of the children." The hospital attempted to counter the spread by isolating more patients, placing them in separate cells, yet the behaviors persisted. Some children spoke Latin without ever having been in the same room as Eleanor. Others drew sigils they had never been shown. It was as if her influence had detached from her body and settled over the ward itself. By early May, the crisis forced new measures. Administrators authorized experiments designed not only to observe Eleanor but to test her. They would measure her physiology under controlled conditions. Seeking some rational anchor for what was happening, the church was not consulted. Faith had already been dismissed. What remained was medicine, struggling to assert itself against phenomena it could not name. But in the minds of nurses, patients, and even some doctors, the explanation was simpler. Eleanor had become a source, and the ward was infected. The official ledgers reduced it to clinical language, patients exhibiting secondary behaviors. But the letters, the diaries, the whispered testimonies all described the same truth. Her presence spread like a sickness, unseen, unmeasured, and unstoppable. The hospital believed science would prevail through experiment, but those who endured the contagion feared that no test could confine what had already slipped beyond her cell. Eleanor's transfer to the isolation cell was intended to mark the end of disruption. Instead, it marked the beginning of formal experimentation. The chamber was small, a single bed against stone walls, observation slits cut into the door. It was here that physicians believed they could study her without interference. For the first time, her case moved from observation to experiment. The first measures were simple. They weighed her daily, measured her pulse, tracked her temperature. The same anomalies persisted. She refused food, yet her weight held steady. Her pulse fell to numbers below survivability, yet she remained awake and alert. Records note conscious activity during pulse decline, a phrase that baffled colleagues who reviewed it years later. By late April, the staff escalated. Electrogalvanic instruments, primitive precursors to modern electrical testing, were brought into her cell. Electrodes were applied to her skin to monitor muscular response. What they found unsettled them further. Her readings spiked with patterns they described as oscillations unaccounted for. The phrase recurs in the lab log, though never with explanation. To later readers, The description resembles tracings that would not exist until the development of electroencephalography decades later. The doctors of 1874 had no framework for what they were seeing. They only knew the instruments behaved as though her body carried currents, inconsistent with human physiology. On April 19th, the logbook notes Eleanor whispering to one examiner as he prepared the electrodes. The words, written phonetically by the assistant, translated to, "The horse will fall and so will you." The examiner, a young physician named Dr. Marlowe, reportedly laughed. He dismissed the phrase as more of her muttering. 3 days later, on April 21st, Dr. Marlowe was thrown from his horse on the road to Salem. He died instantly, his skull fractured on the cobblestones. The hospital staff learned of his death within hours. Nurses whispered that Eleanor had foretold it with exact precision. The administration attempted to contain the rumor. Official reports made no mention of the prediction. The death was listed as an unfortunate accident, but the private letters tell a different story. One nurse wrote to her sister she told him he would fall. He laughed. Now he is gone. After Marlowe's death, the mood in the hospital darkened further. The experiments continued, but with greater caution. Some attendants refused to enter the isolation cell at all. Others crossed themselves before stepping through the door. Eleanor herself remained unchanged. She did not eat, did not falter, did not weep. Her eyes fixed on corners of the room as if tracking unseen movements. When addressed, she answered in Latin, her tone calm, her words often cryptic. One observer noted that her speech during the galvanic sessions took on a chant-like quality. She muttered as the currents passed, phrases no one could translate. The assistant recording her words left blanks in the transcript, writing simply, "Unknown" repeated thrice. The instruments continued to show anomalies, oscillations beyond explanation, sudden spikes as though her body emitted signals, then long plateaus of silence. One doctor wrote in frustration, "The data is not human. Either the devices fail or she is not as we are." Despite the unease, the superintendent ordered the tests to continue. He hoped that documentation would secure the hospital's reputation as a scientific institution. But the more the physicians recorded, the more inexplicable the results became. By early May, the ledger shows nearly daily entries of anomalous readings. Some pages are smeared, as if written in haste. Others contain marginal notes in handwriting different from the main recorded additions or corrections made after the fact. This suggests debate even among the staff. Disagreement over what had been witnessed. The isolation cell was meant to confine her. Instead, it became a crucible where the inexplicable was recorded with unnerving precision. Oscillations unaccounted for. Predictions fulfilled. A death foretold and realized. From here the case would pass from the realm of testimony into the realm of image. For in May of 1874, a photograph was taken, and that photograph, more than any log or letter, became the centerpiece of the mystery. In May of 1874, the hospital authorized a photographic record of several patients under experimental observation. The practice was not unusual. Psychiatry in the 19th century relied heavily on visual documentation, faces, postures, and expressions captured on glass plates to illustrate the supposed signs of mental illness. Eleanor was included in the series. The session, according to hospital notes, was supervised by a local photographer brought in for the purpose. His name was John Alcott. He had supplied the hospital before, photographing wards and staff for promotional brochures. Nothing in his history suggested superstition or fraud. The camera of the time required long exposures. Subjects were instructed to remain still for 15, sometimes 20 seconds while the plate absorbed their image. Patients often appeared blurred, their faces softened by the impossibility of perfect stillness. The effect was expected, ordinary. But Eleanor's image was not ordinary. The notes indicate she sat upright on the wooden chair, hands folded in her lap. She did not speak, did not move. Witnesses claimed her gaze remained fixed slightly above the lens, her expression calm, almost detached. The exposure lasted 15 seconds. By all accounts, she did not shift. Yet when Alcott developed the plate, something was wrong. The image shows Eleanor's body steady, but her head appears doubled. One face looks forward, eyes open, mouth closed. The second face, angled slightly to the right, overlaps at an unnatural angle, the eyes drifting apart as though pulled by some unseen force. The distortion does not resemble motion blur. The lines are too sharp, the separation too distinct. It appears not as if her head moved, but as if two versions of her head existed in the same moment. Chemical smear complicates the effect. A streak crosses the eyes, producing the impression of doubled pupils, one fixed and one sliding. Viewers describe the result as deeply unsettling, a gaze that seemed to follow in two directions at once. The photographer himself reacted violently. Witnesses claimed that upon developing the plate, Alcott collapsed in the darkroom. He was carried out, trembling, unable to speak. Hospital staff dismissed his reaction as faintness from fumes, but Alcott never again photographed within Danvers. He refused further contracts, citing indisposition. The plate was catalogued as D74219 and stored in the hospital's photographic archive. For decades it remained listed in the index, though rarely displayed. In 1938, during a review of the collection, The plate was noted as missing. Its absence has never been explained. What survives is the index entry, references and physician's notes, and second-hand descriptions by those who claim to have seen it before its disappearance. Some argue the photograph was a simple double exposure, an error of technique, but the exposure log maintained by Alcott contradicts this. He recorded only one plate for Eleanor, noting the time as 15 seconds, stable subject, no repeat, no overlay. His logs were considered meticulous, making the double exposure theory unlikely. Others suggest chemical contamination produced the effect. Silver nitrate can produce streaks and smears when mishandled. Yet experts who examined surviving descriptions argued the alignment of the two heads was too precise, too deliberate. A smear could distort features, but not replicate them at distinct angles. The authenticity of D74-19 remains hotly debated. Some claim it was a hoax inserted into the record later, backdated to 1874. Others insist it was genuine, a photographic anomaly that defies natural explanation. The truth may never be known, for the plate itself has vanished. But what is certain is the impact it had on those who saw it. Physicians referenced it in private letters as the image that unsettles. Nurses warned one another never to look upon it for long. One doctor confessed in his diary that he hid the print in a drawer after a single viewing, unable to shake the impression of being watched from two directions at once. The photograph became the centerpiece of Eleanor's legend. More than the language, more than the predictions, it was the visual proof that something was wrong. A child could be dismissed as imaginative. A death prediction could be waved away as coincidence, but a photograph, chemical, physical, fixed, seemed harder to deny. Yet the very disappearance of the plate fuels suspicion. If it were fraud, why erase it? If it were genuine, who wished it hidden? The hospital never explained. The archival log preserves the number D74-19, but nothing more. What remains today is absence. A plate listed, but lost. A description repeated, but unverifiable. An image that should not exist, and yet still shapes the story. The photograph did not mark Eleanor's end. She lived weeks longer, her decline gradual, her presence still feared. But it was the photograph that sealed her place in asylum history, long after the ledgers were redacted and the files scattered. It was the missing glass plate that continued to haunt. The photograph did not end her story. It only marked the turning point toward decline. By early June of 1874, Eleanor no longer spoke. The Latin phrases ceased. The chants and predictions fell silent. She sat motionless in her isolation cell, eyes open but unfocused, her hands folded or slack at her sides. Nurses described her as catatonic, though the term had not yet entered common medical vocabulary. They wrote of her as withdrawn to the utmost degree. Some claimed she stared for hours at the same corner of the ceiling, unblinking. Others insisted she seemed to follow invisible movements with her eyes. Her body did not collapse in the way they expected. She still refused food, yet her frame remained intact, her skin still warm, her weight steady. The physicians grew desperate for explanation. One suggested that the stability had ended, that now her decline would mirror any ordinary patient starving to death. Another feared the opposite, that she might never decline, lingering in some inhuman stasis. On June 11th, the logbook records a sudden drop. Her pulse, already abnormally low, fell into single digits. She lay on the bed, breathing shallowly, eyes fixed but unresponsive. Dr. Gray noted, "Life persists in defiance of all physiology. Her body does not expire, though the heart seems to beat no more." That night, Eleanor was declared dead. The official cause entered into the record: cardiac exhaustion. The phrase was formulaic, the kind of term physicians employed when the mechanism was unclear. But to those present, her death seemed less like exhaustion than a sudden extinguishing. One nurse later wrote, "She ceased as though a flame pinched between fingers." The autopsy was reportedly conducted within 24 hours. Official records of the procedure are missing, but fragments survive in letters exchanged between attending physicians. These describe organs denser than expected, with tissue that resisted incision. The lungs, in particular, were said to appear unusually preserved, as though death had not yet touched them. Some claimed her body did not cool as quickly as others. Nurses noted that warmth lingered into the second day, longer than customary. Whether this was exaggeration or fact cannot be confirmed, for the autopsy notes were later redacted. By the 1920s, her file had been heavily censored. Whole pages were blacked out, others removed entirely. No explanation was given for the administrators described them as routine archival correction, but the inconsistency raises questions. Why preserve a record of intake, of language anomaly, of metabolic irregularity, yet strike the details of her death? Why leave only fragments of an autopsy described in private letters as most unusual? By the time researchers attempted to reconstruct her case in the 20th century, the original file had vanished altogether. Some say it was destroyed in a fire that consumed part of the hospital's storage in the 1930s. Others argue it was deliberately removed, concealed, or suppressed. What remains are scattered references, letters, diaries, the lost photograph, enough to reconstruct a shadow of the story, never enough to see it whole. Eleanor's body was buried in the asylum cemetery in one of the unmarked graves that dotted the hillside. No stone bears her name. No family came to claim her. She disappeared into the earth as countless patients did, absorbed into anonymity. Yet, unlike the others, her story did not end at the grave. The anomalies persisted in record and rumor alike. The contradictions remained unresolved. And her case became a touchstone for later generations who searched the ruins of Danvers for explanations, either medical or supernatural. Her death closed a chapter of her life, but it opened a void of silence in the archive that continues to resist closure. More than a century has passed since the child known as Eleanor C. died at Danvers. Her file is gone, her body unmarked in the asylum cemetery, her photograph missing. Yet the fragments that remain continue to provoke speculation. Modern theories attempt to tame the anomalies, each seeking to explain the impossible within the boundaries of reason. The neurological perspective frames her case as early-onset schizophrenia. The sudden switch in language, they argue, may have been glossolalia, spontaneous eruption of meaningless syllables mistaken for Latin by untrained ears. Her drawings, they say, reveal obsession, not secret knowledge. Her refusal to eat could be interpreted as catatonia, her stable weight as error in record-keeping. 2. Neurology. Eleanor is not a mystery but a tragic example of primitive psychiatry, misreading disease. Psychologists have offered a related explanation through the lens of mass suggestion. They point to the phenomenon of faliadu, a shared delusion that can spread among groups under stress. According to this view, the ward children who mimicked Eleanor's words and marks were not infected by any unknown force, but influenced by fear and imagination. Nurses and doctors, caught in the same atmosphere, reinforced the illusion with every anxious entry in their logs. Skeptics focus on the photograph. To them, D7419 is not supernatural but mechanical error. They argue that double exposures were common in the era, that Alcott's reputation for meticulous logs does not make him infallible. A moment's mishandling, a shift in the plate, a smear of chemicals, these are sufficient to explain the unsettling duplication. The fact that the plate is missing strengthens their suspicion of fraud or accident rather than proof of something darker. Yet even within skeptical circles, some anomalies resist easy dismissal. How to explain the metabolic irregularities, the stable weight, the survivable pulse rates documented in multiple signatures across the hospital's ledgers? Faulty instruments account for some, but not all. Exaggeration explains part, but not the consistency. Paranormal researchers seize upon these gaps. To them, Eleanor represents not disease, but intrusion. They argue that her Latin was not glossolalia but memorian, echo of something older speaking through her. The predictions, the contagion, the photograph, all they say are evidence of possession or haunting. In this view, Danvers was not merely a hospital but a stage upon which other forces revealed themselves. Between these extremes lies ambiguity. The evidence is too fractured for certainty. The medical explanations can account for much, but not everything. The paranormal interpretations attract fascination, but lack proof. What persists is not clarity, but tension, the sense that something happened at Danvers in 1874 that resists final explanation. The missing file denies closure. The vanished photograph denies resolution. What remains are questions that bend between science and superstition, history and folklore. And so Eleanor's case endures, suspended in the space between medicine and mystery. What remains of Eleanor's story is absence. Her body lies in an unmarked grave. Her file has been redacted, then erased. The photograph that should have anchored her case has disappeared. What lingers are fragments, ledger entries, private letters, whispers of memory. They refuse to resolve into certainty. We are left with contradictions. The building that supposedly housed her was not yet completed. The photograph that should not exist is listed in an archive, yet missing. The autopsy was recorded as unusual, then blacked out. Each fragment demands attention, yet each denies final proof. Was Eleanor an ill child, misunderstood by physicians still fumbling toward modern psychiatry? Was she a victim of suggestion, her behaviors magnified by fear until they spread through the ward like contagion? Or was she the vessel of something stranger, an intrusion that left behind traces in language, in physiology, in the blurred silver of a vanished plate? Between the ruins of Danvers and the scattered accounts, we cannot know. The absence resists closure. It leaves only questions. What is undeniable is that one case, among thousands lost in the asylum, refused to vanish entirely. A child who should have been forgotten is still remembered, not for who she was, but for what she became in the records. An anomaly, a fracture in history, a presence that unsettled both medicine and faith. So the question remains, was Eleanor a medical mystery? Or was she something darker, something that even today shadows the ruins of Danvers? The decision is not in the records. It is in you. What do you believe?